What if the answer to Montreal's center depth crisis has been staring them in the face the entire time? Sitting in Los Angeles, struggling to find his offensive touch, and quietly wondering if home might be calling. This is the Phillip Danault question that's been whispered through NHL circles, and it's far more compelling than most realize. Because here's the thing, sometimes the best moves aren't the flashy ones. Sometimes they're the ones that make you think, wait, why didn't we see this sooner? Let's rewind for a moment. Phillip Danault didn't leave Montreal on bad terms. He left as a hero, a two-way center who anchored the Habs' run to the 2021 Stanley Cup Final, a player whose fingerprints were all over Montreal's identity during that magical playoff run. He was the guy who killed penalties when it mattered most, who took the hardest matchups night after night, who made everyone around him better through sheer professionalism and hockey intelligence. Then he signed with Los Angeles. It made sense at the time. The Kings offered term, offered money, offered a fresh start. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. This season, Danault has been a ghost. 5 assists in 29 games. 5. For a center who once averaged nearly a point per game in Montreal, who was relied upon in every situation imaginable, those numbers aren't just disappointing, they're alarming. His $5.5 million cap hit suddenly feels heavy. His contract, which runs through next season, suddenly looks like dead weight on a team trying to navigate the salary cap minefield. And yet, and this is crucial, his defensive game remains elite. The penalty kill is still pristine when he's on the ice. The structure, the positioning, the responsibility, none of that has eroded. What's vanished is the offensive punch, the secondary scoring, the ability to generate chances at even strength. According to Elliotte Friedman and other credible league sources, the Kings are open to moving Danault. More intriguingly, Danault himself hasn't shut the door on a trade. In fact, he's reportedly open to it. That's the kind of signal that rarely leaks unless something deeper is happening. Unless a player is genuinely questioning his fit, or unless an organization is genuinely considering a reset. For Montreal, the connection is obvious. For Los Angeles, the math is simple. They're managing cap constraints, they have internal options at center, and they're watching a veteran underperform relative to his salary. It's a classic seller's market scenario. The Kings aren't desperate to move him, but they're not attached either. That's the sweet spot for a potential acquirer. Here's where this gets genuinely interesting, because the Canadiens have a real problem at center depth right now. Kirby Dach, long-term injury. Dach Newhook, also dealing with injury issues. Nick Suzuki is carrying a massive load, and while he's talented enough to handle it, asking one player to shoulder the entire offensive burden at the position is a recipe for burnout and inefficiency. The Habs need a legitimate second-line center, someone who can absorb difficult minutes, someone who can take the defensive assignments, someone who can stabilize the middle of the ice. Danault fits that profile perfectly. Think about what he brings beyond the stat sheet. Defensive stability. In an era where offensive production is glorified and defensive play is often overlooked, Danault remains one of the NHL's elite two-way centers. He's not going to dazzle you with highlight reel plays, but he'll shut down the opposition's best players night after night. That's invaluable, especially for a young team still developing its identity. Penalty kill excellence. Montreal's special teams have been inconsistent. Danault is a penalty kill specialist. He's the kind of player who thrives in high-pressure situations. For a rebuilding team, that's stability. Veteran leadership. This Habs roster is young. Danault has been through wars. He's played in the playoffs at the highest level. He's experienced a Stanley Cup final run. That institutional knowledge, that calm presence in the dressing room. You can't quantify it on a spreadsheet, but it matters enormously when you're trying to develop young talent. Familiarity. Danault knows the market. He knows the organization. He knows the fans. There's no adjustment period. He can walk in and immediately be productive in a system he already understands. For a team in Montreal's position, young, talented, but still searching for the right veteran anchors, Danault could be the missing piece that allows players like Suzuki, Caden Primo, and the rest of the core to develop without feeling like they're carrying the entire franchise on their backs. But here's where we need to pump the brakes and inject some reality. The cap crunch. Montreal isn't swimming in cap space. They have commitments, they have bridge deals to negotiate, they have a future to build. A $5.5 million hit for a 32-year-old center who's currently producing at a below replacement level is a significant commitment. It's not impossible to make work, but it requires sacrifice elsewhere. What gets moved? What gets sacrificed? What flexibility does Montreal lose in the process? Strategic misalignment. The Habs are in a development phase. They're not trying to win the Stanley Cup next year. They're trying to build something sustainable over the next 3 to 5 years. Investing heavily in a veteran on the wrong side of 30, especially one whose offensive production is declining, might not align with that timeline. Danault is a short-term solution to a long-term problem. And short-term solutions, when they come with long-term contracts and cap implications, can derail rebuilds. The offensive decline is real. Yes, Danault's defense is still elite. But hockey isn't played in a vacuum. You need offense to win games. If Danault can't contribute offensively, and his numbers suggest he can't right now, then you're essentially paying $5.5 million for a defensive specialist. That's a luxury most rebuilding teams can't afford. Here's where this becomes genuinely interesting from a value perspective. The Kings aren't going to demand a king's ransom for Danault. His age, his current production, his cap hit, and his contract length all work against them in trade negotiations. They want to shed salary and reset. They're not trying to win a trade, they're trying to solve a problem. Realistically, a second-tier prospect and a mid-round pick, probably third or fourth round, could be enough. Maybe a second-round pick if Montreal absorbs the full contract. The Kings might even retain some salary just to move him faster. That's cheap for a player of Danault's caliber, even in his current form. That's the kind of value that makes you sit up and pay attention. For Montreal, if the cap math works out, this could be one of those steal acquisitions that people look back on and wonder why more teams didn't jump at the opportunity. Let's cut through all the noise and get to the heart of it. The Canadiens have a choice to make. They can continue developing their young centers and hope that depth eventually solidifies on its own. Or they can make a calculated investment in a veteran who can bridge the gap while their prospects develop. Neither choice is inherently wrong, but they're different choices with different implications. If Montreal is serious about competing in the next 2 to 3 years, if they believe their young core is ready to take that next step, then Danault makes sense. He's a stabilizing force. He's a known quantity. He's affordable, relatively speaking. But if Montreal is still in pure development mode, if they're not ready to commit cap space to veterans, if they're betting on their prospects to become the next generation of centers, then Danault is a distraction. He's a short-term fix that could compromise long-term flexibility. There's also the emotional component that can't be ignored. Danault was beloved in Montreal. A reunion would generate excitement. The fan base would embrace it. There's a narrative there. The prodigal son returning home to help rebuild the team he once led to the finals. But in professional sports, nostalgia is a dangerous currency. You can't make roster decisions based on how good it feels. You have to make them based on what's best for the organization's future. That said, sometimes the emotional play and the smart play align, and in Danault's case, they might. Should the Montreal Canadiens pursue Phillip Danault? The honest answer is, it depends. It depends on whether they view this as a year to make a push or a year to continue building. It depends on the cap situation. It depends on whether they believe their young centers need a veteran mentor or whether they need to develop independently. It depends on what they'd have to give up to make it happen. But here's what we know for certain: the opportunity exists. The Kings are open. Danault is open. The price would be manageable. And the fit, from a hockey perspective, makes genuine sense. For a team like Montreal, young, talented, but searching for stability, Danault could be the kind of under-the-radar acquisition that changes the trajectory of a season. Not because he's going to put up 80 points, But because he's going to stabilize the middle of the ice, kill penalties, take difficult matchups, and provide the kind of veteran presence that young teams desperately need. Is it a slam dunk? No, but it's worth serious consideration. And if the Habs can make the cap work without sacrificing their future flexibility, it might be one of the smarter moves they could make this season. This is exactly the kind of move that divides a fan base. Some of you are thinking, bring him home. He's exactly what we need. Others are thinking, we're rebuilding. Why waste cap space on a 32-year-old? I want to hear from you. Drop your take in the comments. Do you think Danault is the missing piece for Montreal? Or is this a distraction from the real rebuild? Should the Habs be aggressive in pursuing veterans, or should they stay patient with their young core? And if you're enjoying this deep dive into trade rumors and roster strategy, hit that like button. It tells us you want more analysis like this. Subscribe so you don't miss the next time we break down a move that could reshape the league. Because this is just the beginning. The trade deadline is coming, and the Habs are going to have to make some serious decisions about their direction. Let's break it all down together.